Hello, Victoria.
Hi again, Michael.
So I understand that surprisingly there is more that you want to talk about today.
Yep, we've already established that I have many things on my mind. And the thing I wanted to talk about today was guilt and how guilt is like this soggy, wet, gray blanket that just kind of like lays on top of your life and makes everything feel, well, sucks the joy out of it. And how many people, especially with a background of trauma and addiction, I should say, are swimming in that feeling of guilt, and what to start to do to make that better.
Okay, so how would you like to go about this?
Well, so there are two pieces to this. First of all, I think many addicts have legitimate guilt that needs to be resolved because, as I've said about myself and every addict I know, we are happy to lie, cheat, and steal to continue to stay in our addictive patterns. You know, we experience that as our way of surviving, and that is our primary relationship, is our addiction. And we will do anything we can not to mess with that primary relationship. So many people that are addicts, I probably don't need to go into this, but you know, they're happy to steal from their family. I have a friend whose sister came in and took a bunch of stuff out of her house and sold it for drugs. Used her name for when the police stopped her, she gave her sister's name instead of her name, you know, and got her sister in trouble, even though they were eventually able to sort that out. But yeah, people will, you know, as we look at the trade in heroin and opiates, people will do anything to get their drugs. So by the end of that, let's say you do that for 20 years and your children have lived through hell and you've put your family through hell, there's a lot of guilt that you have to address as you come out of that situation in order to have a better life. And the 12 Steps programs, I think, do a good job of addressing that. I don't think I need to go into that in too much depth since there's so much information out there. But it is a great way of looking at what you have done to cause harm. And they start that with the fourth step. You're asked to take a fearless and searching moral inventory, which I think behooves all of us to do in our life, right? To look at our lives, not whether you're an addict or not, but anyone, and just, you know, review it and decide if you have lived a life of integrity, and if not, what do you need to do to change that? And then the other two steps, make a list. I think it's the eighth step. Make a list of the people you have harmed. And then the ninth step is to go back to those people and make amends to them as long as it does not cause more harm to make those amends. Like one of my clients had sexual contact with someone that was younger. You know, he was actually being sexually abused in his home, and he didn't understand really that what he was doing was not okay, and he had, oh my gosh, tremendous guilt about it. But he reworked through that extensively in here, and he wrote letters and, you know, was figuring out how to share his feelings about it, but he didn't actually want to go to the guy because he didn't know for sure that the guy even remembered the episode, and did not want to cause more harm. And, you know, it was unknown if it would or not, and he went with the choice that it could easily bring up things that this man at the time would not be wanting to explore.
Gotcha.
So that's how you make that discernment, is if it is something that you think is going to be helpful to the person, then go for it. If not, then you should, you know, figure other ways to go through that amends process.
Okay.
But the problem with this is, even as though, I think that's a wonderful system, and many, many people have healed a lot of their guilt through that system, many people still end up with this deep feeling of guilt, like there's something irreversibly bad about me. And it doesn't matter what they do, how they talk about it, they cannot get over that guilty feeling. And that's what I'm more interested in talking about. I think in the psychology literature, they call that neurotic guilt. I call it, well, guilt that doesn't belong to you. Let's put it that way. So it's like you can't resolve it because it isn't really your guilt. So yeah, we can call it neurotic, or we could say you're bearing the load of family guilt or multi-generations of family guilt that should not belong to you. So that whole process is different than, you can't take the family guilt and make a list and go and make amends, right? Because you didn't necessarily do the things that you're carrying the guilt for. And so I want to give a few examples of that. Like if a child is verbally abused by their parent, one of my clients was called every name in the book, like fucktard, idiot, disgusting, just on and on. If you could think of it, he was called it. He was sexually abused by multiple people in his family, and he was physically harmed. There was, violence in his family. And despite working for 10 years in AA, he was not able to let go of that sense of guilt that he carried when he first came in to see me, just this feeling of being an abhorrent human being. And so we did a lot of talking about this, and what I pointed out to him, and which I had to learn about too, is if someone is violent towards you as a child and they don't come back later and apologize and make amends and then do something about it, like go, and get anger management or, go to therapy, but something to make this never happen again, the kid ends up, I always say, if guilt is unowned, someone is going to own it, right? It's like, think of it as energy, and it's just sitting there in the room. This person had just an eruption of violence and beat you as a child, never comes back and looks you in the eye and, deeply apologizes, tries to figure out a way to make amends and make sure that it never happens again. That guilt is just sitting there, and the kid's going to be like, well, he's acting like everything's fine. It's got to be me. There's no doubt, someone is going to pick up that guilt, and usually it's the kid. I must be a bad kid. That is why that person is behaving the way they are. I am a bad kid. Secondary to that, if the child picks up the guilt, they have, it sounds kind of crazy, but they have some agency, because if they are bad, they can then become good. And if they become good, their parent will no longer beat them. So it gives them a little bit of control, right? Like, okay, well, I'm bad, I'm doing these bad things, but if I start doing these good things, I can fix this problem, and no longer will dad attack me for no reason. So it's a strategy that makes sense. I'll be the bad kid because then I can become the good kid. But it doesn't work. You end up, always having that guilt. The other reason kids hold on to the guilt is because if you realize that you have a parent or a brother or a sister or a mother that's like a psychopath or a predator, that is just too freaking scary to live with, right? Like you absolutely, as I've said multiple times, have to depend on your parent to live as a young child. And that parent is dangerous, and I don't like to use the word evil, but doing evil things, let's put it that way.
And scary things.
Yeah, doing scary things. You have to somehow make that person okay, because you don't have a choice at 5 to move out of the house and survive. You have to live in that house. So you will say, he's mad because I am effed up. I'm a, bad kid. You will not say he is a terrible, awful human being.
Yeah.
You can't do that. So unowned guilt by the parents or by society, we can look at this racially. You can always go from small to big, right?
Yeah.
Unowned guilt causes the person that has been perpetrated on to end up carrying that heavy load. You know, and it's like carrying a 50-pound backpack or more everywhere you go. You know, it just sucks the joy out of life. You never feel like you're a good person. The standards are, you know, how do you be happy when deep down you know you're a loser? And a lot of times that is the impetus for getting into drugs, right? Then you have the multi-generational process of then you probably are going to cause harm if you do choose to have kids to your kids, and on and on and on. So how to get out of that feeling, you know, of ownership or taking ownership of guilt that doesn't belong to you. I think the very first step in that is to realize this is not my guilt. I mean, that is actually sort of a major awakening to realize, no, the people that caused me this harm are the people that should be feeling guilty. Why am I walking around with this guilt? And people have a, you know, it seems kind of like straightforward, but people have a very hard time when they've tried to make their parents into decent people when they're really, most of the time, not. They don't want to give up that fantasy. They don't want to let go of the fantasy that they were loved, and that, you know, sometimes I'll ask somebody, like, what was your life like growing up? It was good. It was, yeah, I had a great childhood. I was really happy, right? I feel like that little story there, I just like scratched my finger across that story, and pretty soon there's blood and tears spilling out on my floor.
Well, I think as kids, it's like you said,
Yeah.
we don't have the ability or, you know, resources. Like, you know what, I'm out of here. I'm packing up at 5, I'm going on. So you have to find some way in your head or in your heart to make peace with the fact that I need you. Is that love? You know, but at the same token, I'm afraid of you. But the bottom line is that I can't go to the store. I don't have any money. I can't pay rent. I don't know where to go. So, you know, this person that is clearly giving you feelings that don't feel good,
Yep.
you know, is still your only means of survival at
Right.
the time.
That's exactly right. So you will pick up the guilt, and you will try to keep your parents in a positive light, even when they absolutely should not be seen in a positive light. Oh, you know, I keep saying parents, but like our culture of hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years of racism, right? The way we treated black people, the way we treated, you know, I don't need to go into all the different races. I think we know anyone that wasn't white was demeaned and used and not allowed to have opportunities. And then I think some of that shame that was not owned and that we're still trying to own, the people that were kind of running the show back then, got transferred onto the people of color that, you know, were marginalized.
You know, and that's kind of being played out on both sides of the historical track. You still have, and I can speak to this having, you know, a Southern family, some of them have not let go of it. So you have modern day descendants of folks that were enslaved and treated horribly, who insist on making the descendants of the people who committed those atrocities feel bad. I mean, and that's misplaced. I mean, you figure it's 2022. How many people were alive in 1865 when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed are actually around today? I think other than in the ghostly form, we can safely assume 0. So it's unfair for someone who's a descendant of someone who was a slave to expect someone that's a descendant of someone who owned a slave, to expect them to feel guilty about it. I mean, it's not their shame to carry. It's not their guilt. But we do seem to transfer it along. I mean, just like with abuse, you know, my grandfather abused his wife. My father abused his wife. So am I supposed to jump on this bandwagon? And we have to look at, our own choices, our ability to express free will. And a lot of us, we pick up guilt only because we had room in our shopping cart. What'll fit here? Oh, that's a perfect spot for a nice six-pack of guilt. And it's not ours. We should have passed on it. It's like buying that extra sweet in the aisle. Why do we need it? Do we really need to carry this around? And I just find it interesting that I know that I carry guilt for things that, people in my family did. Had nothing to do with me, but I'm a part of that tribe, or was at that time. So the whole generational transference of responsibility, whether it's guilt or pride or whatever, is like we need to uniquely have our own identities.
Yeah.
And be responsible for the things that we should feel guilty about that we had a hand in.
So anyway, when we struggle with the neurotic guilt, or the guilt that isn't really ours, it's a process to go through to determine, am I feeling guilty for something that I actually did? Because that's what the 12-step process is about, looking at that. Or do I just feel like I'm intrinsically bad because that was the message I was given by the people, the guilty people that treated me poorly in my life? And so that, I think, that's an essential part of therapy or any processing around trying to understand our trauma and how that has affected us emotionally. And I know I absolutely thought I was a bad kid. We talked to Denise. She said at 15 she made the decision that she was irredeemable, she's so bad, and that's when she started using drugs heavily. Like, when you see yourself as irredeemable, it's almost impossible to continue trying to live a normal life. You're worthless, literally worthless. And in her case, I think in my case, in your case, the guilty parties have never apologized for anything they did. Never. Nor do they even realize maybe that they need to apologize, right?
Yeah.
I have heard this story over and over and over again. Sexual violence, physical violence, verbal abuse, horrible neglect, torture that I couldn't even have conjured up, the things that people have told me, with absolutely no apology made to the kid. And I'll tell you, every single one of those people have walked into my office feeling like they're a bad person. And the whole process of therapy has been sorting that out and coming to understand who might not want to label people bad, although sometimes people just are, but that the people who took these actions, these horrific, violent actions, are the ones that need to feel guilty. And that is a difficult process. But again, it's like taking something out of your backpack, your load, your pain, that tends to drive people towards addiction, and giving it back to the parties that should own it, even if they won't claim it. Drop it off at their doorstep. This is yours. I'm not taking it anymore. And there's a lot of different therapeutic methods that do try to work on that neurotic guilt and shame that doesn't belong to the person.
So as far as offloading, let's call it their nasty luggage, how are we getting, first of all, how do we identify that we're carrying someone else's guilt? And secondly, at that realization that, why am I feeling bad for this? I had nothing to do with it, but it's kind of become enmeshed with your identity.
Yeah.
So how do you begin to separate yourself from that?
That is so true. It is, unfortunately, becomes woven into the beliefs we have about ourselves as a person, that I am a bad person. And I know that was the case for me. I always felt like I was a bad person. And it didn't matter what I accomplished, how well I did, no matter what it was out in the world, I never felt like I was good. And I constantly apologized, constantly. That's part of the reason I knew, I'm sorry. And I was constantly trying to make up for my badness. Like, I did a lot of positive things, but the goal of those things was to make me not bad, versus sometimes just doing it because that was what, I wanted to do as a human being. Like, I was doing volunteer work, etc., which some of that was authentic, and some of it was I'm trying to make up for the badness of my basic core being.
Of your existence.
Yeah.
Something that tagged along just like your name. Because I am a rodent, I have this issue because by virtue of the fact of relationship. And I could see where that would be difficult, especially whatever someone has lumped onto the identity of who they see you to be. I do wonder, doesn't there have to be a certain level of buy-in in order to accept that guilt? Or, take for instance for me, just really quick, there was a judo instructor there in Los Angeles who, basically catapulted a lot of us up into the national spotlight. But this judo instructor had inappropriate relationships with one of his students, right? And we shared the same name. And so now, the name of the dojo. So how do we get rid of the stench of, wow, the senseis at this dojo do this to female students? So now we're carrying that. I felt like I carried it with me because I was a part of that dojo. It's not that I had control over his actions, but I still felt like that shame was that was part of mine now. I had to help shoulder that shame.
It's interesting because when I was writing the book I wrote about addiction and connection, I compared that guilt that's woven into our beings as like having, in fisherman terms, like when you have a knot, fishing net, and the knot is like got all kinds of binds and is tied in multiple different angles in such a way that you look at it and you go, oh my God, right? Like, how are we ever going to undo this? That's called an asshole in the world of fishing. That horrible, messed up knot in a net that needs to be unbound, right? I feel like the process of pull a little here, pull a little there, pull a little there, like trying to get a knot undone, which is really hard, is the process of determining whose guilt belongs where. Right?
I'm immediately reminded of the shipping news, but
yeah, that wonderful book. So so the term asshole, the slang term for a horrific knot in your gear, is the term that I use when I think about trying to untangle the guilt that belongs to us, the guilt that belongs to our family members, the guilt that belongs to generations of people. And I don't want to say like it's just like this, like I kind of gave a easy answer when I decided I wasn't going to be smiling anymore, right? When I was not happy. This is harder because you have to kind of almost look at each person that had profound effect on your life and start to think about, who they are, what they did, how it affected you, and to start to have your feelings towards that person that are appropriate, right? And sometimes those feelings are not easy. Like that person that you thought was a good mom, but you realize she watched you be beaten by your dad and did nothing. Just stood there and went and got a glass of wine, right? Like, to start to understand her guilt. Like, why didn't she stand up? It's like, well, it's the guy, he did it. Takes more than one person in a family like that to allow something like that to go on. And I remember one of my clients telling me, Everyone in her family knew that she was being sexually abused. Everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And her mother, it was a brother that was doing it, wrote the brother a letter saying, you need to stop touching, I think it was 2 daughters that he was doing this to. And that was the extent of what was done in that family to stop the sexual abuse that was happening right in front of their noses. And of course, the brother didn't do anything. He didn't do anything until he left home. And then eventually was arrested and put in jail for sexually abusing multiple other young girls, right? Mm-hmm. So who's feeling bad? My client. She felt like she was a piece of shit, mm-hmm. that no one cared enough, even though everyone in the family knew, to do anything. I am just a useless piece of shit, right? That's how she felt. Going through the process of understanding, my brother sexually abused me. My dad, he was just not around. Mm-hmm. There was no one to go to. My mom knew, but she didn't do anything. She wrote a letter. All my sisters knew. Nobody did anything. And I am standing here with all this guilt and shame about being a gross person, mm-hmm. because at 3, my 15-year-old brother is putting objects into my vagina. Mm-hmm. And by the way, when I talk about clients, I definitely, half the time I change the sex, but I'm not talking about one specific person. I am talking about a lot of different stories that I've heard that I kind of configure into an example. So in this is an example of, several stories that I've heard. Mm-hmm. And, I don't want to give away anything that is private information that one of my clients might share with me.
Yeah, we're really taking extra steps
Yeah.
to protect the anonymity
Yep.
of the people you've encountered during your
Unless
journey.
I have permission, so.
Exactly.
Yeah, but, okay.